Welcome back to Face the Nation. In Asia this weekend, President Donald Trump's most urgent priority is the North Korean nuclear threat. We're joined now by Major Garrett, who is with the president in Tokyo and can shed some light on what message he plans to send to the North Koreans while in the region. Major?
Good morning. President Trump began his extensive swing through Asia here in Japan, and moments after Air Force One touched down at Yokota Air Base, the president donned a bomber jacket and told a region already jittery with fears of war that dictators, and by that he meant North Korea's Kim Jong-un, should heed his warnings about military might. The president said history shows us that tyrants only bring poverty, suffering, and servitude. An apt description of life in much of Kim's increasingly isolated and economically hobbled hermit kingdom. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe greeted Mr. Trump warmly. Abe's government remains encouraged by the president's hard line on North Korea, and Japanese officials say China has never been more motivated to deal with the North, a reflection, they say, of the president's harsh rhetoric. North Korea will assuredly dominate all of the president's conversations here in Asia, and he said aboard Air Force One en route here that either in Vietnam or the Philippines, he will have a side meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Topic number one, you guessed it, dealing with North Korea, especially having Russia apply harsh sanctions passed by the United Nations. John?
Major Garrett for us in Tokyo. Thanks, Major. And we're back with more from our panel. Jerry, what are the stakes here for the president? 12 cities, 5 days, or 12 cities that he's going, 12 days, 5 cities, sorry. What are the stakes here for his trip?
Well, you know, the White House is saying this is the longest Asia trip by a president in 25 years. And so it tells you that Asia is central to the foreign policy calculations of the president for two reasons. One is the obvious confrontation with North Korea, and the other is the attempt to have a tougher trade relationship with China. And the key on this trip is whether those two things can fit together. Can you cooperate with China on North Korea while still having a pretty tough trade conversation with China on its own terms? And that's, I think, the challenge for the president. You know, I do think Asia is going to loom large throughout the Trump term.
Ramesh, do you think it's the president, say, focused overseas, he's got important business over there, leave the tax conversation to his colleagues, or do you expect, does this hurt the Republican tax cut push that the president, who is a marketer, a salesman, knows how to brand things, is overseas?
When you talk to Capitol Hill Republicans, they are not concerned that President Trump is going to be out of the country while they're trying to roll out these tax packages. If anything, they are pleased. They would prefer to be able to make this case without the potential of distractions from the president, without the potential of his maybe undermining some elements of their plan.
Right. Susan, you checked back in with the Trump voters 1 year after his victory. What did you find?
Well, we found with our Trump voter panel, that's kind of a focus group we've had for a year, that they like his policies. They're not really concerned, most of them, about the Russia investigation, but they're unhappy that things haven't gotten done, and they identify the problem as his own behavior. 2/3 of the people in this focus group identified Trump's behavior, and especially his tendency to tweet, as a reason he's not getting things done. A truck driver in Boise said to us, you know, he's not drowning, but he's also not on land yet.
Jamel, speaking of things that, it's interesting to hear people are not concerned about Russia. This was the week that we saw real moves, right. Not speculation, but actual moves by the special counsel. What did you make of that decision by Mueller?
I thought it was sort of a remarkable bit of power politics playing, right? That not just the charges against Manafort, which I think a lot of people sort of saw something like that coming, but specifically the charges against Papadopoulos, which were a surprise and did seem to signal some sort of deeper ties between the Russian government and members of the Trump campaign that did seem to throw the White House off balance. And that does matter. I've spoken to some Trump voters over the course of the year, and to a person, they're like, this Russia thing is all nonsense. But it is the case that it does disrupt the president's administration. It does disrupt his attempt to push policies forward. And in the case of trying to push something like a tax reform bill, it matters that the president's attention is elsewhere. It matters that the White House is dealing with what may become a legal crisis for key members as they're trying also to pursue an agenda.
One of the things, the ways the president's reacted, Ramesh, is that he's said to his Department of Justice, you should be investigating Hillary Clinton. He really jumped on this Donna Brazil news about her claim that Hillary Clinton basically had the Democratic National Committee on her side. that's the, obviously the criticism is the president's not supposed to be jawboning his attorney general in this way. Do you think there's any peril in that for him, or is this sort of behavior that from President Trump, because for some people that's a huge deal, putting that pressure on the Department of Justice?
It's the sort of thing that if it were coming out of a clear blue sky would be completely shocking and would lead to a real uproar in D.C. But because it's President Trump and because there's so much background noise from him where he's done so many similar things and violated so many previous norms, it doesn't register in quite the same way. I think all of this stuff, the attack on the Justice Department for not going after Clinton, the occasional attacks from Trump's allies on Mueller, they're basically keeping his base in line. They're keeping his base with something to say that is positive for them or at least negative about the Democrats. I don't think it's working on independent voters. I don't think it's working on Democratic voters. Yeah,
one of the things I think really should be emphasized is just how far Trump's approval has fallen from even a low point. Multiple job approval polls came out this past week, and they all showed Trump at the high 38 and at the low 34. That while his base may not be shaking from him, increasingly, most Americans are looking at this presidency as something close to a failed one.
Although, you know what? Problems with Republicans, problems for Democrats, too. I mean, here is this opportunity with a president with record low approval ratings a year after his election, and Democrats are now in the process of just fracturing in ways that endanger a big election coming up on Tuesday, the Virginia governor's race. This is a race Democrats ought to win. It's a state Hillary Clinton carried last year. It's a state with 2 Democratic senators, and yet the election of the Democrat is not guaranteed. That is going to be a very close race.
You know, it seems to me the Democrats have to get in a position in which they can stop debating Hillary Clinton. I mean, that's got to make Donald Trump very happy, right? Every day the Democrats are arguing about the Clinton campaign is a good day for Donald Trump because that's what he wants people focused on. And Democrats somehow have to get beyond 2016 and into 2018 and 2020. Although, as you note, that's hard because there's a split in the party. There's a progressive wing pushing the party to the left. There's a centrist part of the party that wants to hang in there with Clinton-like policies. And that's not an easy thing to finesse. And you're seeing in California in the race, the re-election race for Senator Dianne Feinstein, just how tough that might turn out to be.
A quick note on the Virginia race, though. I think it matters for Republicans, too, because the Republican nominee, Ed Gillespie, is running an interesting campaign of starting out with a sort of business-focused economic message, but in the closing stretch, focusing on the Confederate statue controversy. A mailer went out showing an NFL player kneeling, sort of focusing on these like culture war, sort of white identity politics issues, immigration. And if Gillespie wins, that kind of shows a potential path for Republican candidates next year.
Well, that's right, Ramesh. Do you find, is that right? A Democratic strategist said to me that Ed Gillespie is not running on Trump, not running with Trump, but running on Trumpism. In other words, using the tactics and strategies. And is that replicable? At least Gillespie's doing pretty well by the polls. Do you think that's something that Republicans will go to school on? Do you see this race as a template?
Well, I think the Trumpiness of the Gillespie campaign has been overstated. I mean, if you think about the George H.W. Bush campaign in 1988, with its emphasis on law and order, with the Willie Horton ad and so forth, and which, of course, people at that time criticized as having a racial subtext or racial overtones, we're getting the same thing here, but it's basically bedrock Republicanism, this support for law and order. The fact is, Virginian voters are concerned about MS-13. Sanctuary cities that Gillespie's against, Northam, the Democratic candidate, has now flip-flopped, and he's against them, too. So I think that Gillespie is running the kind of campaign nearly any Republican would.
I think that this illustrates how Trump has taken over the Republican Party, even if he has a small base. And for evidence of that, just look, the only Republicans who criticize him are Republicans who are either out of politics or getting out of politics.
Go ahead.
And I think there's a critical context in Virginia that has to be said, which is that on August 12th of this year, white nationalists killed someone in Charlottesville, Virginia, and running the kind of campaign Gillespie's running in that context, I think reads very differently than, say, Bush 88.
Jerry, let me ask you about Donna Brazil's book, former DNC chair. What do you make of it and her charges about Hillary Clinton?
Well, this goes back to the point I made before about the Democrats need to get beyond Hillary Clinton, but that book is going to pull them all back in, at least for the foreseeable future, into a debate about that. The book is fairly remarkable by all accounts because it is a complete rehashing of that civil war within the Democratic Party. And what I found a fairly amazing acknowledgement that there was consideration at the party headquarters of finding a way in September of 2016 to undo the nomination process. I've never heard of anything quite like that. Now, you know, the Clinton people are reacting as you would expect them to react, with indignation and also a sense of, you know, this is just old scores being settled. But it keeps the conversation alive and backward looking for Democrats.
One thing I'm interested in, Ramesh, is and we'll see if this is true in Virginia, is there's a theory that in off-year elections, of course, Democrats don't turn out the way Republicans do, but Donald Trump would get them to turn out. Is that also what's at stake here in Virginia, which is that some sense of the power of Donald Trump as a motivating factor for Democratic voters in an off-year election?
I think that is one of the things that we're going to find out. I think for much of the year, Democrats and some Republicans have been assuming that Trump would be a powerful motivator for Democratic voters. But I think if you look at the way that the Democrats are actually campaigning, they haven't been quite sure how to play this issue. In the primaries, Ralph Northam ran a very tough anti-Trump ad, but subsequently he said he'd be willing to work with Trump. This may say something about Northam's strengths or weaknesses as a candidate, but I think it also shows that there's a question mark for a lot of Democratic strategists. How do you play this? Because even voters who are against Trump doesn't necessarily mean their number one priority in a governor is his being against Trump.
You know, this race is a test between which party is more broken. A Republican Party led by Donald Trump in a blue trending kind of state, a purple state trending blue, or a Democratic Party where, by the way, Bernie Sanders has refused to endorse the Democratic gubernatorial candidate, which is extraordinary.
All right, we're going to have to end it there. Thanks to all of you, and we'll be right back. And we're joined now by author Michael Lewis, whose book, The Undoing Project, has just been released in paperback. And Vanity Fair magazine has just published his latest investigation into how the Trump administration has been staffing government agencies, in this case, the Department of Agriculture. Michael, welcome. Why the Department of Agriculture?
That's a really good question. Isn't it amazing that Vanity Fair let me write 13,000 words on the Department of Agriculture? So there's a conceit here at play. It's a series. And the conceit is that the Obama administration went to great lengths to prepare for the transition. They deputed hundreds of people, spent the better part of a year preparing briefing books, preparing talks, because we have this odd system of government where, you know, on election day, the people who've been elected have to get up to speed very quickly to run the government. I mean, that's what the election's about, right? Who's going to run this government? And the Obama administration expected the Trump administration to be there the next day. Parking spaces set aside, desks, you know, computers with internet connections set up for them and all the rest. Nobody showed. In many of the agencies, nobody showed.
And this is just after Election Day?
Just after Election Day. So the cramming period takes place from Election Day to the inauguration, and where you learn what's going on in these various agencies. And so the briefings, to a large extent, never happened. And so I thought, I'll go get the briefings, figure out what they might not know. I mean, you know, there was a kind of a great course in how our government works waiting to be taken that had no ideological flavor to it at all. It was like how you take a census or how you collect taxes or this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So why the Department of Agriculture? Because I had no idea what it did. I was just curious. You know, I started with the Department of Energy, and when you go into a place like the Department of Agriculture, you were shocked by how important it is. It's like, you think of it as like paying farmers not to grow stuff. That is a trivial part of the budget. A big part of the budget is feeding poor people, feeding people who, that's the most of the money. So
food stamps.
So if you want to look at the social safety net and where it is maybe vulnerable, where holes may be ripped in it, the Department of Agriculture is a very good place to look.
Now, the president, in talking about State Department staffing this week in an interview with Laura Ingraham, said, well, we don't need all those people at the State Department. And there is that view, like, oh, well, they didn't staff it right away, but, you know, what do we need all these people there for?
What do you need people actually running the government for?
What is what goes wrong in the system if there's not the attention?
Let's take an example. And their approach to it, because this is right. I mean, I think his basic attitude is the government really doesn't do anything that's that important, or that I can't just take care of with a flick of my wrist. So inside the Department of Agriculture, there is a roughly $3 billion a year science budget, and and they're dispensing grants to researchers to figure out how we're going to grow crops in a changing climate, mostly. Most of it has to do with climate change right now. I mean, 40 or 50 years from now, we may be able to eat or not eat because of the science that's done now. That job has always been I mean, the Obama administration, the woman who held it was named Kathy Witecki. She spent 50 years preparing for that job. I mean, she was an agricultural scientist who had studied, the connection between the American diet and American health, who knew the science world, who knew the university researchers who do the work. Into that job, Trump put a man named Sam Clovis, who is basically known as a right-wing radio talk show host from Iowa, who has absolutely no science background at all. Now, what happens? What happens when you do that? Well, he's not himself capable of participating in the conversations you need to have to decide where this money should go. What probably happens is you politicize the science budget. He himself doesn't think climate change is true, so he's not going to be directing money to prepare for climate change. I mean, these jobs, they're powerful, influential jobs. And if they're vacant, what happens is, for a brief time, career civil servants step in and sort of fill the void, but without any direction and kind of trying to guess what the Trump administration might want. But they're already risk-averse government employees. They're even more risk-averse. And there are places in the government, sorry to interrupt. No. There are places in the government where we really need them to be taking risks because they're preparing us for the future. I mean, this enterprise is important.
Sam Clovis, of course, withdrew this week because he was implicated in the Russian...
He's still in the Department of Agriculture. He withdrew from that job.
What did you learn, last question, in this deep dive you did in government? I mean, what surprised you when you did all these interviews?
Caliber of the people. Yeah. That's the amazing thing. It sounds simple, right? That it matters a lot why you're in the job, what your motives are. And there are passionate, dedicated, hardworking people who are fighting hunger in America, trying to figure out how we're going to eat 50 years from now, trying to make sure that rural America doesn't just collapse. I mean, the Department of Agriculture is the touch point of government for rural America. And the people who are in those jobs, a lot of them are in there for a reason, because they care about it. And they aren't doing it to make money in the private sector afterwards, kind of thing. So if you have, there's a spirit of public service that still exists, that's precious, and without it, the society collapses, and we ought to treasure that.
All right, Michael Lewis, great piece. Thank you. We'll be right back. During President Obama's 2 terms in office, Chief White House photographer Pete Souza was there for moments of historic importance, as well as lighter and more personal moments with the president and his family. Souza's new book, An Intimate Portrait, showcases 300 of the nearly 2 million photographs he took during those 8 years. And Pete Souza joins us now. Welcome, Pete. I want to ask you about your role in the room. You're taking photographs, you're recording history, you're recording a moment, but you're also capturing an emotion in that moment. There's a picture in particular in the Oval Office where the president is meeting with some young activists, and the way you framed it, they're African-American activists, you framed it with a bust of Martin Luther King, Lincoln's on the wall. Tell us about that process a little bit when you're capturing a moment like that.
Well, I was consciously aware of the bust, obviously, during the meeting itself when they're seated around the chairs and the sofa, and it just was not lining up. And just as the meeting broke up, the president had a last exchange with them, and that's when I went and tried to get that bust in the foreground and include Lincoln.
And do you have a kind of a sort of emotional sense of the moment, which is in your head, but you're also trying to capture what's right in front of you too, right?
Trying to capture a moment, but trying to accurately portray the mood and the emotion of what's taking place.
You obviously had extraordinary access to the family, and one picture that struck me was the president with his daughter. They're on the swing set. Mm-hmm. What does that picture mean to you?
It actually means a lot to me. It was during the BP oil spill, and he had just finished a meeting and was walking to his desk, and he saw Malia out on the swing set. And even though he only had 5 minutes with her, he was all in with her. There was no BlackBerry, there were no aides hovering around. He spent, 5 quality minutes with Malia just in the middle of the day.
Did you ever feel like, maybe this is a too intimate a moment, I shouldn't be here? How do you wrestle with that?
It's intuition, and in that particular case, I tried to make a really good picture, and then I backed off and let them have their private conversation.
You were also there for the nitty-gritty of government and business and deals, and there's a picture where the president is seems to be motioning to somebody who's left the room. What's going on in that picture?
I'm glad you chose that picture to highlight. I love that picture because I think it tells you a lot about his relationship with Nancy Pelosi, who you don't even see. They had just had a meeting in the Oval Office, and they had this really interesting back and forth. And as Nancy was, the leader was leaving towards the West Wing lobby, he was pleading with her one last time. And if you look really closely in the picture, you can see her hand sticking out in the doorway.
There's another picture which is just of the president's head, and what strikes me about some of these pictures is he is trying to find space in a room full of people. Maybe that's a misreading, but the presidency is both a lonely office and an office in which they're picking at you all the time. What is that picture that you capture just of him? He's got his hands together almost in prayer. Kathleen Sebelius is right behind him. What's going on in that picture?
As I recall, that was during the healthcare debate, and just in the weeks leading up to the vote in Congress.
And another moment, of course, when pictures when the president went to comfort the families at Sandy Hook Elementary. Mm-hmm. Tell me about that.
He calls that the worst day of his presidency. I mean, the day that he found out what had happened at Sandy Hook. You have to remember that was only 4 weeks after he was reelected to the president. We're in the midst of the Christmas season. The White House is decorated with Christmas lights and trees. It was a very joyous time, and then this awful tragedy happened. And I think he was looking at it not just as a president, but as a parent, imagining what it must be like for you to send your 6-year-old kid off to school, what we all consider a safe zone, and then you find out you're never going to see them again because they were shot to death.
When you look at the subject that you photographed over this 8-year period and putting this book together, what do you come away with? The presidency rests on that figure. How did that figure change between the first photograph and the last?
I always tell people that I knew him when he was first elected to the Senate in 2005, and by the end of the administration, the character of the man had not changed at all. I think his core was still the same. I look through the book now, and so many things happened during his administration. There's so many issues you have to deal with, and yet you still try to maintain a normal life, family life, as a father and a husband.
All right, Pete Souza, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for being with us, and we'll be back in a moment. That's it for us today. Be sure to tune in next week when we'll sit down with Trump voters to get their views 1 year in. That's also for CBS This Morning on Friday. Until then, I'm John Dickerson for Face the Nation.